certain changes within the structure of a writing. Then there are certain devices related to style of writing, then certain devices related to the narrative techniques. Now the second thing is what is figures of speech. So figures of speech on the other hand are a subset of literary devices. As I have already said that figures of speech is a part of literary devices. So they primarily involve the use of language in non-literal ways, and how you are using a language that all things would be included into the figures of speech. Examples of figures of speech are metaphor, synecdoche, and consonants. So these are all the terms which we are going to discuss further in this particular lecture. So don't get just scared at what these terms mean, right? So we are all going to discuss this all the terms. Now that is one figures of speech. A periodical table is giving, like we have in chemistry, which is related to elements. So here, literary person have created the periodical table of the figures of speech. So these are some of the important figures of speech or literary devices which are included here, like metaphor, then synecdoche, metonymy, then personification is there, then antennaklasis, then synapses, simile is there, onomatopoeia is there, then irony, oxymoron, paradox. Just go through all these terms, then you have to just remember all these terms, and then you have to do a deeper study related to these terminologies. Now, what kinds of questions which are asked from these terms are that just they will going to just give you a lines from a literary piece. It can be like a drama, it can be novel, it can be poetry. So they will just pick a lines from a particular text, and they will ask you a question that identify the literary devices which is used in this particular line or in this particular quotation. So that you have to identify. And sometimes they will also ask for the definition or the meanings of these kinds of devices as well. So you just have to remember there are certain similar terms like oxymoron, paradox. So they are similar. So you just have to identify how these terms are different from each other. So you have to remember the particular definition of these terms as well. Okay, so there are certain examples like personification. So personification is something whenever you are giving a human-like characteristics to any non-living things, then it would be considered as personification. So the example is given here that the opportunity knocked at his door. Now the opportunity is something abstract thing, right? It is not a living being, so it can't knock at our door, right? So this way they are using the language. So then it would be considered as a personification. Now the metaphor, in metaphor you are comparing two different things, like without using any kinds of symbols. Like for example, metaphor and simile are two, like they are similar things. But what we find is simile is that there are certain linguistic markers, like as, like, which are used in simile. But in metaphor, we don't have any linguistic marker. Then alliteration is that you all know, right? Repetition of initial sound of a word within a sentence, right? So it can be two or more times, and it would be considered as alliteration. Then here the example is also given that she sells seashells on the seashore. So onomatopoeia is there, then hyperbole, then euphemism, then irony and anaphora. So these all the terms which we are going to discuss in detail as well. So let's get back to our first term for today, that is allegory. Now what is the allegory? So an allegory is a work in which character, places and action represent broader ideas or a concept. So allegories often make use of other literary devices like personification, symbolism, extended metaphor to more effectively make a point. So now, what is allegory? Allegory is generally used throughout the story. Like it is not like you will read one or two lines and you will find allegory within that. And for that, in order to understand what kind of allegorical representation done by the author, it can be political, it can be religious, it can be historical. And so in order to find out that allegorical representation, you have to read the entire text. Now, an allegory is a storytelling technique used to convey something symbolic to the audience. What happens in allegory is that the story is saying something else with parallel to that, there is another story is going on. And so you have to understand both the stories parallelly and try to find out what kinds of moral that stories are catering, that you have to see. So an allegory is a narrator or a visual representation in which a character, place, or event can be interpreted to represent a meaning with a moral or political significance. So allegory is something which is doing a kind of a visual representation of some historical event. It can be of a political event, and it can be a moral story as well. So allegories meaning change from the use of symbols in a work to convey a hidden meaning to a work which uses symbols to convey a hidden meaning. So what this sentence suggests is that earlier allegory used with reference to symbolism, that any literary piece which are using certain symbols, then it is considered as a allegory. But over the period of time, we have seen the changing definition of the allegory. Now, the current definition of allegory is that a work which uses certain symbols, right, which can be from religion, which can be from history, and they are conveying certain hidden meaning. So the two parallel stories which are going on, right? One is direct story, which are said through words, and another is indirect story which you have to identify as a reader within the allegory. Now, what are the characteristics of allegory? That it contains beginning and end, right? Within allegory, because allegory is a kind of a story, right? So it has some beginning, it has some climax in between, and it has some ending as well. And now, the second thing is allegory has a message or moral. So there are certain stories which we might have read in our childhood. That is like stories of Panchatantra. So all these stories can be considered as allegorical story because they are using certain animals, certain birds. And they are providing a kind of a moral lesson at the end of the story, right? So all the allegorical stories have certain message at the end of the story. Then another thing is it adds to a theme to the story, right? Allegory is also adding a kind of a theme. Like it can be political event, historical event, religious event. So that become a theme of that particular allegory. Now, allegories are often used to convey political, social, and moral meanings that we have already discussed. So here are some of the types of allegory given. First is classical allegory, which is written during the time of Old English period and medieval English period. So these types of allegories are all actually originated in Greece. And so the very origin of the classical allegory can be found in the stories of Greek mythology and Greek philosophy, right? Within which you will found the classical allegory. And the best example that we have is the Plato's allegory of the cave. Right, so that you might all have studied this story that people who are living in the cave, they are considering that whatever they are seeing is the real world, but that is not the real world, right? That is only a shadow of the objects which are coming from the light of sun. So that is the allegorical story, and that is also an example of classical allegory. Now the second is biblical allegory. So within biblical allegory, we will find certain themes, characters which are borrowed from the stories of Bible. Right. So the best example that is the Chronicles of Narnia. So in which the very character Aslan, who is represented as a Christ-like figure. Right? So that can be considered as a biblical allegory where the themes from Bible is used. And the last one is modern allegory, which are written recently. Right? So modern allegories are allegories which comment on our current zeitgeist. So within modern allegory, we found certain current scenarios or current happenings of the world. It can be social event, political event, it can be cultural events. The best example that is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. So it can be considered as a modern allegory. Now there are other types of allegory as well based on the what kinds of themes that stories are representing. Right? So moral allegories that can be A Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Right? So in which they give a journey to salvation, right? So they are using certain biblical theme as well as they are providing certain moral lessons at the end of the story. So it can be considered as moral allegory, then political allegory. So George Orwell's Animal Farm, right? It is based on the Russian Revolution, which is happening during that time, 1917, 1905, right? Two Russian revolutions were there. So that is a political allegory. And they are using certain characters which are not happening in the real life. And so they have given the theme of Russian Revolution, but the writer is not directly mentioning that this story is based on the Russian Revolution. And so as a reader, if we have studied that story, if we have studied that historical event, then we will be able to identify that this story is also giving a kind of a hidden meaning as well. Then there is religious allegory, that is the Dante's Divine Comedy, that could be considered as the best example. Then philosophical allegory is there, like Plato's allegory of the cave, which is given in the Republic book. Then social allegory is there, and historical allegory. Right? So these are some of the types of allegory. Now the next terminology or literary device that we are going to study is the alliteration. Now the alliteration, as you all know, that alliteration is a literary device that reflects repetition in two or more nearby words of an initial consonant sound. So for example, if you have a single line within which there are different words, right? And within those words, if a single sound is getting repeated again and again, and it can be of two, like minimum is like two, right? And it can be two or more times, then it could be considered as alliteration. Now, alliteration is a stylistic device which can be used to bring a rhythm within a poem. And within the alliteration, there are certain consonant sounds which are getting repeated. There is also another term in which the vowel sound is getting repeated. So that term is known as assonance. Right? So you have to identify the difference between alliteration, assonance, and another term is consonance. Right? So alliteration is something in which the word sound which is getting repeated at the beginning of the word. Right. And within consonance and assonance, the sound is getting repeated, but it can be in between of the word as well. So that you have to differentiate between this terms. For example, the phrase "kids coats" is alliterative. Right. So there is one example is given that within alliteration, you don't have to mistake that the alliteration letters are not getting repeated. The sounds are getting repeated. In English, we have 26 letters, right? But in beside that, we have 44 phonemes as well. So phonemes are sounds which are getting repeated here. So that you have to identify. So kids, coats. So here you will find in first word there is K, and again coat C-O-A-T, right? So C is the sound which is pronounced as K, right? So that can be considered as alliteration as well. And the second example is given here, that is phony people. Now that is not alliteration because PH, which is pronounced as F, that is not pronounced as P, right? So phony people, though the word P is getting repeated in both the words, right? But that will be not considered as an alliteration. So that you have to identify here. Now the alliteration is generally used to make the verses more melodious, more flowery, interesting, and musical, and it adds a rhythm to the particular lines. Now it is not necessary that alliteration is always used in poetry only, right? It can be used in drama as well. If you are writing a long paragraph, so readers might get bored by reading those long paragraphs. So what you can do is you can add certain figurative language, you can add certain alliteration. So whenever the readers are reading, they will get a kind of a pleasing effect in their mind. So that way alliteration can be used. Example is given here that Peter Piper picked a peck of a pickled peppers. Okay, now the examples of alliterative words that can be from popular words, and it can be also from certain fictional characters. The names of that characters are alliterative. And so Peter Parker, that is one character. Wonder Woman, Mickey Mouse, that you all have seen, right? Daffy Duck, Peppa Pig, that is also a cartoon. Wicked Witch of the West. So these are some of the famous fictional characters. Within their names, they have used alliteration. Then examples from popular culture, like we have Coca-Cola, Polly Pocket. Polly Pocket is a company who are providing or producing dolls, right? Rainbow Room, then Weight Watchers, Fantastic Four, House Hunters. Now, examples of alliteration within the literature. So, here are some of the examples are given. There is one line from the rhyme of ancient mariner by S.T. Coleridge. The breezes blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. So, in the first line, we will see a repetition of B sound, breezes blew. Then foam flew, the furrow followed free. Right? So F is getting repeated 5 times, and we were, right? So W is getting repeated here. Then there is one famous line from the Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, that from forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives. So within the first line, we will see the repetition of F sound. So these are some of the examples of alliteration. Now the second thing is allusion. Now allusion is a literary device where an author refers indirectly to a person, event, place, or another work of literature, art, or history. So what is allusion is that within a literature or particular literary text, you are referring a totally different events which might have happened within the past. Right, so that can be considered as allusion. And allusion is a reference, typically brief to a person. It can be a reference of a person, it can be a reference of a political leader, it can be a reference of a king, right? It can be a reference of a thing or any event or other literary works with which the reader is presumably familiar. Now what we have to see here, that you will be able to identify the allusion within a literature if you are familiar with those things only. And if you are not familiar, then you won't be able to find that the writer have used certain references. So allusion means intertextuality, that you are using certain references from the other text as well as from other resources as well. So as a literary device, allusion allows a writer to compress a great deal of meaning and significance into a word or a phrase. So what happening in the allusion is that there are two parallel stories which are going on. Right? So you have to first find out the literal meaning of that particular text, and then you have to go for the implied meaning, which is hidden in between those texts. Now, these kinds of allusion is only effective if the readers are able to recognize those allusions. For example, if you are reading the Westland, then there are certain references of Buddhism, right? There are certain references of Greek mythologies. So you will be able to find those references if you are familiar with those myths, and if you are familiar with the philosophy of Buddhism and Jainism. Right? So then you will be able to find the allusion within a literary piece. Now, if an allusion is obscure or misunderstood, it can be lose effectiveness by confusing the readers. So, if you are not able to convey those allusions effectively, and if the readers are not able to get those allusions, then it might create a scenario of confusion. And the another thing is, allusion adds layers of complexity and meaning to the text. So, it is a kind of an intertextual meaning. Now, the types of allusion in literature. What kinds of allusion which are used within a literature? So, there are certain mythical references which are used within a literature, as I have given the example of the Westland. Right. Then there are certain biblical characters, biblical stories which are used within a literature. Then it would be considered as a biblical allusion. And literary allusion is that you are using certain famous text and certain famous quotations from the other writers. Then it would be considered as literary allusion. For example, the famous quote by the Shakespeare, which is appear in the Hamlet, right? To be or not to be. So that is also used by many writers in their work as well. So that would be considered as literary allusion. Then there is also a quote from the 1984 that Big Brother is watching you. And so that is also used by many writers in their works as well. So that would be considered as literary allusion. Okay, so the next term is the anaphora. Now here also we will see a repetition, but this is different from the alliteration. Within the alliteration, we will see a repetition of a single sound, which is getting repeated in a single sentence. And here, you will see a repetition of certain words or certain phrases. Then it would be considered as the anaphora. A deliberate repetition of the first part of the sentence to achieve an artistic effect. Now, these kinds of anaphora is generally used by speech. Used in speech. If you want to do a public speaking, then most of the motivational speaker or any kinds of speaker, they are using the anaphora, right? They are repeating a certain phrases within in the beginning of their sentences. This technique adds emphasis and unity to the clauses. So whenever you use anaphora, it will give a kind of a soothing effect in your mind. It is used to appeal to the emotions of the audience in order to pursue them, inspire them, and motivate to encourage them. Now, there are certain types of anaphora. So, pronominal anaphora. So, what happens in pronominal anaphora is that you are repeating the pronoun of a particular person, right? So, in first sentence, you will say a name of that person, and after that, you will saying about the characteristic of that person by using he, she, or it, right? So, if you are using pronoun in the later sentences, then it would be considered as pronominal anaphora. So, Lucy went to a cinema, she was happy, right? So, again, they have used she word. So that is pronominal anaphora. Now the second is adjectival anaphora. So Lucy went to a cinema, her boyfriend bought the ticket. So whenever you are using adjective with reference to the name of that person, then it would be considered as adjectival anaphora. And last is one anaphora. I broke my phone and I have to buy a new phone. Right. So examples of the anaphora from the literature is the best example is from the Charles Dickens, right? So a tale of two cities within which we will find that it was the best of the time, it was the worst of the time, it was the age of wisdom and it was the age of foolishness. So within these sentences or phrases, we will find a repetition of the words it was it, which is getting repeated, right? So that would be considered as anaphora. And we shall not flag nor fail, we shall go on to the end. So this is an example from the famous speech which is given by Winston Churchill in 1940, right? So here also we will see a repetition of the phrase we shall, we shall. So that is the example of anaphora. Then there is another example from the speech which is given by Hillary Clinton. That is, it takes a family, it takes a teacher, it takes a clergy, it takes business people. So it takes, which is getting repeated here. Then there is another example from the William Blake's poem, The Tiger. Right? So what the hammer or what the chain? In what furnace, what thy brain? What the anvil, what dead grass? So within this lines, what word is getting repeated again and again. So that is anaphora. Now the next term which we are going to discuss, that is antithesis. So antithesis is a word which is often confused with paradox or oxymoron. So these three terms are similar, right? If you wanted to search for a meaning, then within this three term you will find that they are giving certain contradictory ideas within a one sentence. Then it is considered as paradox and oxymoron. But there are certain minor differences which you have to identify. So the word antithesis comes from the Greek word meaning setting opposite. Right? So two opposite sentences, two opposite meanings, or two opposite ideas which are combined in a one sentence, then it would be considered as antithesis or paradox or oxymoron. But within antithesis, you have to use into inverted commas, right? So that is the identical marker that you have to find, that whenever the antithesis is used, at that time there are two paradoxical ideas which are presented within a sentence, but they are bound by into inverted commas. So antithesis is a rhetorical and literary device with parallel grammar, right? So you have to see here grammar as well, grammar structure, but which establish a nearly complete or exact opposition in ideas or characters. It can be effective in emphasizing the drastic differences between opposing concepts. So example is given that one small step for a man, one giant leap for a mankind, right? So two paradoxical sentences are given, but there is into inverted commas which is also given, then it would be considered as antithesis. No pain, no gain. Then out of sight, out of mind. And these two paradoxical ideas are always separated by comma. That also you have to see. The next term is camus, right? So it is a core. Camus involves the repetition of a similar ideas in an abbreviated pattern, or specifically, it is a figures of speech where two or more clauses are related to each other through a reversal of structures to make a larger point. So what happens in a camus is that there is one sentence which is reversed in the another part of that sentence, and it would be considered as a camus. The camus offers a powerful tool to create balance, tension, or dramatic effect within the lines of a poem or the paragraph of prose. So if we will see the examples of camus, then you might get the better idea about this. So the first shall be the last, and the last shall be the first. Right? So first you have to separate two sentences which are given here. The first shall be the last, and within the second sentence you will find that the last word is coming first and the first word is coming last. Right? So in that way, if the writer is manipulating the language, then you can be considered it as a camus. Then the second example is from Lord Byron's Don Juan, that is pleasures a sin and sometimes sins a pleasure. Then there is a famous example from the Midsummer's Night's Dream, that is a fair is fall and fall is fair. And so sentence is getting reversed within the second part of the sentence, then it would be considered as the camus. Okay, next term or literary device, that is hyperbole. So hyperbole is used throughout common conversation, speech, rhetoric, film, and literature. So this term is normally used in speech within rhetoric. It can be also used in film dialogue as well. Hyperbole is a literary device used to draw emphasis through certain extreme exaggeration. And so if you are expressing your feelings, if you are expressing your emotions, so whenever you are exaggerating your emotions, then it would be considered as hyperbole. For example, if you want to say that any movie which is your favorite movie, right? So you have watched it 3 or 4 times. So if you wanted to say in the format of hyperbole, then how you would say that I have watched this film thousands of times, right? So this won't be possible. You will not going to watch that film thousands of times. And so you are exaggerating the things, then it is considered as hyperbole. So what is hyperbole is used for describe a feeling, right? So if there is any kind of extreme feeling which you are experiencing, to describe that you can use hyperbole. Then emphasize a point, right? If you want to put a pressure on any kind of word within the sentence, that you can use, then you can use hyperbole. Then if you want to do a comedy delivery or if you want to make the environment light, so for that you can use hyperbole. So here are some of the examples that if you want to describe a feeling, then there is the example from the Titanic film. Right? So Jack stands at the front of the ship and explaining. So he is experiencing a very good time of his life on the ship Titanic. So at that time, what he says that I am king of the world, but actually he is not. He is not the king, right? He is coming from the lower strata of the society. So still he is saying that I am a king of the world. So that kind of feeling he is experiencing. Then if you wanted to emphasize. If you want to put certain emphasis on certain words, then there is example from the President Franklin Roosevelt. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So this is the opening statement which is given by him in his first speech. Right? So what he is saying that in the entire world, the only thing from which we have to fear is fear itself. Right? So that all people know. That fear is something which we need to avoid, right? Which we need to reduce. But still, he is emphasizing on that point. Then there is another example which is of comedic delivery. So there was no getting around the fact that the boy was deeply and gloomily miserable, hopelessly miserable, a miserable that was almost beyond the reach of imagination. So this is taken from the Mark Twain's Adventure of Tom Sawyer. And so this right now you will not get a kind of a feeling of smiling or laughing because you are not familiar with that particular story. If you get familiar with this story, then you will get here that the kind of a hyperbole is used within this statement. Now, this next thing is imagery. Now, what is imagery? Is a literary device that uses vivid language and description to appeal the reader's senses and create an emotional response. So, imaginary is a literary device. So, what happens is in this literary device is that whenever the writer is writing something, or whenever as a reader you are reading that things, it will create a kind of a visual image or a virtual image in your mind. So then it would be considered as imagery. Imagery can be created using other literary devices. So in order to create imagery, there are other literary devices are also used like simile, metaphor, onomatopoeia. Right? So imagery used for establishing a world or setting, creating empathy for a character's experience, then immersing a character into a situation. So, in order to connect the readers with that particular characters, generally writers are using imagery. There are different kinds of imagery, like visual imagery. So, if a kind of image is getting created in your mind, then it would be considered as a visual imagery. Then, if the writer is doing certain delivery through words, then it would be considered as auditory imagery. Then, olfactory imagery is that if they are creating an image of certain smells, right? So then it would be considered as olfactory imagery and gustatory. And so if the writer is creating an image of certain tastes, right, which we experience through our tongue, so then it would be considered as gustatory imagery. And last is tactile imagery, that you are getting a feeling of a touch or a movement through this images. Now the examples of imagery. So first is auditory imagery. So knock, 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 right? So if the writer is using that word, it will create a kind of an image in our mind that someone is knocking at the door, right? So these kinds of words are used to create imagery. Then olfactory imagery, butter smell shivered him awake. It was a scent as old as the word. And so he wanted to just mention a kind of a smell which is coming from that area. But he is using certain images and he is connecting that smell with other things. Right? So it will create a same smell-like feeling in our mind. So that is from the Dead Path by Stephen M. Irwin. Now, there is another thing which is given here, that is cognitive process of poetry, imagery, translation. And how these kinds of imagery which are getting translated in our mind whenever we are reading that particular text. So the table is giving here. That first that image, then he will going to create he will going to use certain language to describe his feeling. And whenever the readers are reading those images, then they are working as a translator. And those kinds of images is also getting created into their mind. Now the next is irony. Now irony is a fundamentally storytelling. Irony is the opposite of expectation. So what is irony is that the writer is saying something, but the meaning of that particular thing is completely different from what they are saying. Right? So what we might have expecting is completely different from what is happening in that particular field, then it would be considered as irony. So irony is a literary device in which the reality is opposite of what we expect. The key here is opposite, not just different, right? Language, what we say is versus what we mean. So within language, we will find irony that someone is saying something and they are what they wanted to say is completely different from that. And within circumstances, we will see an event that we are expecting some kinds of reaction from certain people, but they are getting a completely different event, right? So that is irony of circumstances. Now the examples of irony. So first is dramatic irony, right? So these are also types of dramatic irony. So dramatic irony generally happens within a drama. And what happens in dramatic irony is that as a reader or as an audience, we might be knowing about that situation. but the person who is experiencing that thing, they are not aware about that thing. So it will create a dramatic irony for the audience or for reader. So we will see the example of Romeo and Juliet. So whenever in the last scene, what happens is that Romeo is getting entered into the house and he finds that the Juliet is dying. Right, but as an audience, we know that she is not dying. Right, she has just taken a sleeping potions, and because of that, she is sleeping. But the Romeo considered it as if she is dying, and he killed himself. Right, so that creates a kind of a dramatic irony in which the audience are aware about the events, but the characters who are performing in that particular play is not aware about those things. Then there is another example, that is Oedipus Rex. Sophocles, right? So, as an audience, we know that the Oedipus has already killed his father and getting married to his mother, but he is not getting that idea because he is not aware about that who is his mother and who is his father, right? Then there is verbal irony. So verbal irony is when someone says something, but they mean the totally different thing. So there is example from the Pride and Prejudice, right? So the Mr. Bennet is praising his wife that you are as handsome as any of them, Mrs. Bennet, and Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. And so as an audience, we know that she is not handsome at all, right? But still he is praising. So in that way, it will create a kind of a verbal irony. And the last is situational irony, when certain events or situations are created within the literary text. So situational irony is when we expect one thing, but we are getting a complete opposite event. So Animal Farm, right? So Animal Farm, if we read as a child, then we might think that it is a story about the animals, right? But it is not the story. It has certain political, deep political references as well. And the another example is the necklace story. Now the next one is onomatopoeia. Now onomatopoeia is a literary device in which the pronunciation of words imitates the natural sound emitted from an object or an action. So whenever we use onomatopoeia, what happens is that we are using certain words which are similar to the sounds that things are making. Right? So there is certain action which is going on. So the sound of that action is mimicked or imitated within those words. Then it would be considered as onomatopoeia. So the word onomatopoeia can be traced back to the ancient Greek word onomatopoeia, which means the making of a word or name. And so there are certain theories that how the words are formed. And so we have certain earlier theories like Big Bang theory, then poo-poo theory. So these are the theories which are in which we find that the words are created by imitating certain actions. Right? So the same references came here as well. Now the benefits of using onomatopoeia is that allow readers to understand the sound being expressed. So whenever you are using certain words which are describing the action, then it will help to readers to connect with those events as well. Then it will add the rhythm to the action. Then it will create a kind of a vivid or live imagery within the mind of readers. So examples like buzzing. So whenever we pronounce this word, the buzzing, the z sound is coming, which is the bees are making, right? So the word which is formed from the action of the bee. Then tick tock, right? Which is the voice of the clock, right? So from that the word is coming. Then the water went splash. So when we pronounce the word splash, so whenever we are splashing the water, the same sound is coming out of it. The lion roared loudly, right? So when we pronounce this word roar, so it is making a sound like the roaring of a lion. So the words which are coming from the action or certain events, then it would be considered as onomatopoeia. The examples from literature, so the Edgar Allan Poe's The Bells. This is the short story, and in which he is using certain words to represent the different sounds which the bell is making, right? So how they clang and clash and roar. So these are different sounds he is expressing of bells to the morning and the groaning of the bells. Right? So clank, clash, roar. So when we pronounce these words, we are also getting a kind of a imagery within our mind related to those actions. Then there is another example from Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. So he saw nothing and heard nothing, but he could feel his heart pounding. That's a pounding is a word. And then he heard the clack on stone. So clack on stone, the word clack is a onomatopoeic word. And the leaping, dropping, clicks of a small rock falling. So click is again a onomatopoeic word. So this is it for the presentation. I hope you have learned certain newer terms as well. And at last, we are going to do one Kahoot quiz, which I have prepared. Right, so we will going to play that quiz. It is visible. So the game pin is here, or you can scan the QR code as well. So if you want to scan this code, or you can enter the game pin as well. So if everyone have joined, then just let me know. There are eight people are there. Many of you are still together. Can we start? Or anyone still trying to join? There are only 20 people. In class, there are 30. I think it has a limit of 20. No, it has a limit of 40 people. So anyone is trying to join, or shall we start? So there are 23 people. Okay, so can we start? So here is your first question. Identify a literary device used in the following sentence. The loud librarian told everyone to quiet down. So you have to just identify the literary device which is used in this particular sentence. The loud librarian told everyone to quiet down. Right, so the right answer is irony, and only 3 people have given the right answer. Right? So the librarian himself or herself, their voice is loud. Right? Still, they are asking the people to keep calm, keep quiet. Right? So that is the irony used here. So Bhumima Gohi is on the first position. The second question: which of the following work is an example of an allegory? You have to find the allegorical work. So the Great Gatsby by F. Scott, then Animal Farm by George Orwell, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, or the Hamlet by William Shakespeare. So you just have to identify the allegorical work, and the right answer is the Animal Farm. Okay. That is a historical allegory. That historical event is used in this particular allegory. So still, the Bhumika Gohi is on the first position. Okay, next question is: select the figure of speech or poetic device used in the expression Matthew met Michael at the mayor's mood. And Matthew met the Michael at the mayor's mood. So you just have to identify the poetic device. This is easy one, right? I hope everyone will get it correct. Okay, so 20 people have given the right answer, alliteration. Next question. Gaslights bloomed on the new street like flowers and lit with a pop at night. Identify the use of figures of speech. Gaslights bloomed on the new street like flowers and lit with a pop at night. So you have to identify 2 figures of speech which is used in this particular statement or quotation. Yes, the right answer is simile. Gaslight bloomed on the new street like flowers. Right? So street like, that is a simile. And lit with a pop at night. So pop is a word which is giving a kind of a onomatic effect. Right? So simile and onomatic. Only 2 people have given the right answer. Right? So Dhantri Verma as the first position. Next question is: identify the figure of speech in the following sentence. I have a ton of homework to finish. I have a tons of homework to finish. So whenever you are exaggerating the things, so what kind of poetic device it would be considered? Okay, so right answer is hyperbole. The first option, 18 people have given the right answer. The next question is, which of the following terms refer to a reversal of syntactical order often for rhetorical effect? So the definition of one literary device is given here. So you just have to identify that literary device. So when we will see the reversal of words within a sentence, then it is considered as chiasmus, right? So 7 people have given the right answer. Akash Gowda is in the first position. Okay, next question. What literary device is being used in this example? Well, I am no Hercules, but I could open that jelly jar for you. Well, I am no Hercules, but I could open that jelly jar for you. There are certain devices which we haven't yet discussed, right? They are also included in this quiz. So the example is illusion. Well, I am no Hercules, right? So that is a person or a historical figure which is used here. The next question is the famous line from Wordsworth, Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud, employed which figures of speech? So the answer is simile. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Right. So as is the marker here through which you can identify this literary device. Okay, the wind whispered through the trees a soft lullaby that danced in the moonlight. Identify the figures of speech. So in this particular question, all answers are correct. Right? There is personification is also there. Then there is alliteration. The wind whispered through the trees. Right? So that is personification. Then alliteration, wind whispered. WW is getting repeated here. Then metaphor is also given and imagery. It will create a kind of an image here. Next question. In which work does T.S. Eliot use multiple allusion to classical and religious texts? This example I have given in between, right? So in which work you will find the references of classical allusion or mythology is used. There are also certain references of religious texts. That is the Westland by T.S. Eliot. The next question. Which literary technique involves the repetition of the same word or group of words at the beginning of successive clauses? Just focus on the word repetition of the same word. It is not the repetition of sound. It's the repetition of same words. Right, so it would be anaphora. If there is repetition of sound, then it is alliteration. But here the repetition of words or phrases. So 9 people have given the right answer. Which work is a prime example of dramatic irony where the audience knows more than the characters? So within this work, you have to identify the dramatic irony is used in which of the work. Okay, so the right answer is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. And then there is another example of dramatic irony, that is by Shakespeare, Macbeth. So this is the end of the quiz, and on the podium on third position we have Ratri Parmar, then second Bhumiba Gohil, and first Akash Davda. Right, so congratulations. Attention and support.